how many of you have went to Rhonda's session earlier today talking about XP to Windows 7 deployment? That's kind of what we expected to happen. Why would you put two sessions in the same event with the same basic? Well, apparently it's a popular topic. People hear more about it. So Rhonda kind of went through the high level and went through a single scenario. I want to try to go through more in depth and talk about the specifics about image creation and then the deployment process itself. So obviously, if you're interested in moving from Windows XP to Windows 7, you are running XP today. And, well, time is running out, so hopefully you have a plan and you're now just really getting into the depth of what that plan is going to be. How am I going to get from Windows XP to Windows 7? Full support for that has already expired. We're now in the extended support phase. Extended support ends in April of 2014. Basically, that just means that you will get security updates for Windows XP until then. So if you do the math and say that you're going to do a Windows 7 deployment as part of a hardware refresh cycle and you're on a 3-year hardware refreshment cycle time frame, you better get moving because, well, shortly past 3 years, you're going to run out of time and XP will drop out of support. So a lot of people now are looking at Windows 7 as a definite improvement over Windows Vista. And also, well, we had to get off of Windows XP because we don't want to run something unsupported. So what exactly does that mean then? I wanted to try to focus a lot more on the demo side of it, less on the PowerPoint slides. So we really won't go too much into PowerPoint slides. In fact, the slides that are up there are more for my anything else to remember. What did I want to talk about? First off, how many of you divide up your responsibilities between the team that's responsible for creating the image and the team that's responsible for deploying that image? That they're two different groups of people. Okay? Not too many of you. That typically would represent the larger enterprise, but that doesn't mean that even for the smaller and mid-sized enterprises that you don't want to at least think about those as two separate processes. So the first part that we're going to talk about is that gold image creation process. How do you build your reference image that you're going to use as your master for all of your deployments? As part of that, we really want to focus on some best practices. First of all, the fewer images you have, the better. Ideally, you have one image and you're using that for all of your machines. And then you can leverage the deployment process farther down the road to extend or to layer on top of that image to get each machine configured appropriately. Second, the image creation process itself should be completely automated. So there should be no touches at all when you're building the image. It should be press a button to get it to start and then go get some coffee, go get some tea, come back a couple of hours later, and hopefully you have a new image that's been successfully created. That way you get into that cycle of being able to repeat that process anytime you want to make a change and not have to worry about what regressions, what errors might get introduced into the process if I didn't do something right the next time around. The days of trying to do the 37-page OS build where you read a document that says click by click, here's what you need to do, should be gone. You really want to get it to the point where the computer does all the work, not the person sitting in front of the computer. Also now, with the advent of Hyper-V and VMware and all these virtual machine solutions, hopefully you're building your operating system images in a virtual machine. It's not bad if you're building them on physical hardware. You just run into a few challenges like what happens if the driver that you use to build that reference computer image now conflicts with some other machine in your environment. That won't happen if you're using a virtual machine to build your master image. You don't have to worry about those types of issues. It will be a little slower to do compared to physical hardware, but generally it's fairly easy to do. And in fact, we've even described how to do things like image factories where you can create PowerShell scripts to drive Hyper-V to automatically do these build processes for you. So you could even get it to the point where you could automate this to run a daily build where you just tell it, okay, go create me some new images. Tell me when you're done. So to actually do that process, I want to walk through using the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit to do that, similar to what Rhonda had looked at this morning, but really trying to focus more on just every piece of the puzzle. So when you first get into MDT, you would get a blank slate, and you need to start filling it with stuff. So the first thing I need to do is create a new deployment share, which I will call Demo. It needs to be shared out because all the client machines are going to connect to that share to actually get the content. I can give it a description so that I can see it in the console. And in this case, I do want to ask if an image should be captured. So basically, when we create a task sequence, that task sequence deploys an operating system, but then also includes steps to say, go ahead and sysprep it and capture a WIM at the end. How many of you are using MDT today? Maybe 25%. So for those of you who are doing that, you're probably used to this already, and this is kind of a rehash, but bear with me. We'll get into some more in-depth stuff as we're going through. For everything else, we'll just take the defaults. And now that deployment share will actually be populated with the base set of MDT scripts and the tools, the task sequencing engine, some of the tools from the Windows Automated Installation Kit like ImageX and BCD Edit and things like that get copied into that share because they'll be used as part of the deployment process. But other than, say, 100 meg or so of stuff, this share is now completely empty. We haven't added anything to it. So that would be the next step. We want to start adding in the contents of what we're going to use to build our reference image. First thing that we need to build a reference image is an actual operating system. So let me go ahead and create a new folder here first. I'll just call this original source, mainly for organizational purposes, but we'll see what other things we can do with this later. And then into that, I'll import some operating systems with the full set of source files. So basically, I've just taken the full media and copied it to disk. So first, I'll add Windows 7 Enterprise x64. And as part of that import process, we know various details about what was in that WIM. Then repeat the same thing for x86. Oops, missed. And we'll do the same thing with that one. So that becomes the starting point. If you really wanted to, you could take those images and deploy them directly to all of the computers in your environment. With Windows XP, that would have been a set of i386 source files. It takes forever to install. With Windows Vista, Windows 7, we actually ship an install.wim on the media that is a sysprepped WIM file. You could deploy it directly. Most people choose to add additional stuff on top of that. So you would go through this image creation process and add your core applications, the things that are really needed on every machine, mostly to save time and potentially, in some cases, to actually meet your auditing requirements or whatever policies you have in place that say when you deploy the OS, it needs to have a firewall, it needs to have antivirus, it needs to be fully patched. Whatever requirements you have, you can take care of those in the core image. So I don't actually need any drivers because I'm in a virtual machine. But I probably do need some packages. So let me create a folder to put these packages in. I'll call that for master images. And then I can import into there. All of the critical updates that have been released since Windows 7 came out. There aren't too many of them so far. I think there were 24 or 25 of them, so it doesn't take too long. So basically, these are all of the MSU files that you would download from Windows Update or from the security bulletins. An MSU file, though, is what you would install interactively in the OS. So if you downloaded an MSU and double-clicked on it, it would run a utility called wusa.exe, and that would actually extract what was inside of that MSU file and get the actual update, which is a cab file inside of it. When we're doing this, we're going to be injecting these offline as part of the deployment process. So the Windows setup process will take care of injecting these into our image when we're creating it. There's just one problem. Windows setup has no idea what to do with the WUSA file, with the MSU file. All it knows how to deal with is that cab file that's embedded inside of each one of these. So the import process has to strip the wrapper, the MSU, which is actually a cab file itself. It has to strip that away, get at the innermost cab file, and then add that into the workbench. Yeah, basically the process that's happening behind the scenes would be the same as if you were using DISM, and actually DISM does exactly the same thing. So when DISM is going to inject an update into, say, a mounted WIM that's for your operating system, it will do the same thing. It'll strip the cab file out of the MSU and inject that into the operating system. So you could do the same thing manually. You could just use extract.exe, or you could rename the MSU file to .cab, double-click on it, see that there's another cab in it, and just copy it out and use DISM to inject that. So we're kind of doing the same thing in both of those cases. The main thing that we're doing, though, is we're letting setup take care of the details. Setup, in turn, runs DISM, so it ends up achieving the same thing. We don't really want to get into those manual maintenance scenarios of saying, well, I'm going to take my image that I created last week, mount it, apply more updates to it, and then commit those changes. You could certainly do that, but you kind of lose that audit trail. You lose track of just exactly what's been done to that image, so that the next time you regenerate it from scratch, you don't necessarily know what happened to it. So generally, we would always say, well, if you got more updates to install, just crank out a new image. Once you get it to the point that you just press a button and go, then that's kind of trivial overall. So I've got the updates there, which are actually a mixture here of x86 and x64 updates. We can see the KB articles that are associated with each one of those. Now we probably need some applications. So let me create a folder here for master images. And then inside that, create a few applications with source files. So the first one I'll put in there is Office 2010. How many of you put Office into your image? Wow, that's surprisingly low. Usually we say, well, it doesn't really matter, that it just might take a little while longer to install Office as part of your deployment process. If you put it in the image, it tends to be a little quicker. So adding it into the image, applying it during the process, either way it ends up getting installed, so it's not a big deal one way or the other. In my case, I'll go ahead and add it to the image here by pulling in the install files. How many of you know what else needs to be added to the command line for Office 2010? Nothing. You just run setup.exe. The real trick to it is you need to specify a transform file that provides all the details, actually a patch. And we'll look at a second here. So we'll import all of those files. Kind of the same thing with the Office updates. The updates are provided as patches. The configuration is provided as patches. You end up just dropping all of those into the updates folder of your Office source. And as part of the install, the Office setup engine is smart enough to look at all of the patches that are in there, and it automatically installs them as part of the installation process. If you really wanted to, you could even chain in additional things with the config.xml file. In our case, though, we'll keep it simple, and we'll use the Office customization tool, which is really no more than running setup.exe/admin. There's no separate orc download anymore. You just run the setup utility. And at the end, you need to take the resulting MSP file and save it into the updates folder. So that's what it's telling us to do, put it into our deployment share applications Office 2010 updates folder so that Office Setup can find it. So then we run the Office customization tool. I've actually already got a customization file in there. So we'll open that, which I swiped from MSIT. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Office 2010, you might think, well, that's bad. That means that I've grabbed the MSIT product key. No, Office 2010 uses KMS. So there's no product key at all in here. If we try to do the absolute minimum configuration to install Office silently, all we really need to do is come in and accept the license terms. Tell it to use a KMS client key because it's going to use KMS for activation. We can set the display level either to none or basic. Make sure that it doesn't do a completion notice. Suppress any modal dialogues and don't allow it to be canceled. And you might want to put in an organization name or something like that. But basically that's all there is to installing Office silently. And at that point we can save that back to the deployment share as an MSP file, which is a patch. And then Office is ready to go. You may need to do additional customization of Outlook settings or how do you want the various components of Office configured, but just to get it to install silently, that's a good starting point. So the question was around language packs. With Office, language packs, well, you have downloadable language packs for Office. So you download the main product, so say Office Pro Plus, and that will come with one language. In my case, I have English. If you wanted to add another language pack, you would just need the single language pack files that you could download from the licensing center. Then click on the Add button here, and it'll browse to the folder that contains that additional language pack, and pull it into your single Office installation source. So then what you end up with is the core binaries, which don't change between languages, and then multiple language packs. And at that point, if I had more than one, when I selected the product that was on the share, we would see that there are more than one language present, and we could check off which ones we wanted to install. By default, when Office Setup runs, it's going to install the language that matches the language of the user presently logged on. So when we're building the image, we run as the local administrator account. If the local administrator account is in English, Office is going to install English. If it's in Japanese, it's going to try to install Japanese. If Japanese isn't available, it will fall back to English. So there are some basic rules like that. If you wanted to override those rules, say by installing multiple language packs, then you'd have to come in here and check the additional language packs that you wanted. In the end, that's really just editing this config.xml file. Oops, I have to apply my changes. But if you look on the Office Resource Kit documentation, which is a web page because there's no separate downloadable ORC anymore, you can specify all of those things in this file. So all of those language settings end up in there. So Office is simple enough. Let's add something else. This really becomes the fun part. I mean, Office is reasonably well documented as far as silent install, enterprise deployment processes go. But for some other applications, it's not quite as obvious. Like, let's say we wanted to install Sun Java. Don't know why you'd want that on every computer, but hey, for some reason, some people do. So if we go to Sun Java website, we can download the installation files. And then we had to try to figure out, well, how do you install that particular thing silently? So what the heck is the command line for that one? Well, fortunately, there are other people out there in the world that want to do such a thing, so they've gone through and figured it out and documented it. So just to save myself some typing, I went through this yesterday and figured out that, well, that's the command line that I really need. So I can paste that in there. If you look at that, can you tell anything about Sun's packaging of Java? Yeah, that actually tells me quite a bit. It means that the executable is a self-extracting executable. Inside of it is an MSI, because those command line options are standard MSI exec command line options. So how many of you have tried to figure out, well, how do I install an application silently? Well, where do you go when you're trying to do something like that? appdeploy.com is probably the #1 resource to figuring out how the heck do I install all these third-party applications quietly. The challenge is you may run into 25 different answers, some of which the vendor would probably look at and say, well, that's completely unsupported. And in other cases, you'd look at it and say, well, that's way too complicated. But you can just keep going through the list until you find one that looks simple and looks like something that a vendor would actually support. So in the Java case, you could actually follow the links into the Java support knowledge base that actually describes how to do this. So Java's not too bad. Maybe we also want to put maybe Acrobat Reader. So everyone wants to have Acrobat Reader. Oops. Same basic process there. We need to add the source files. For Acrobat Reader. And that command line's not quite what you would expect. But again, that's one of those that's on appdeploy.com and is included in the Adobe deployment documentation as well. So we basically repeat that process for every application that we want in the image. And it's not just going to be apps that users actually run. You might also want to add just runtime type files. And a good example of that is the Microsoft AppV client. There are actually 2 of those. Helps if I put that in the right place. There's one for x86 machines and one for x64, so we had to add each of those separately. The good thing is they both take the same command line options. Which I can never remember. So it's another one of those self-extracting MSI wrapped applications. But if you've installed the 4.6 version and you actually try to skip that and go directly to the MSI, it actually fails because the setup.exe in the AppV client 4.6 installs other dependencies at the same time. So like C++ runtime files, they didn't actually put them into the MSI, they put them into the setup.exe wrapper. So that's why we're running the setup.exe wrapper. It takes care of all those pieces for us. So that's the x86 version. Let's add another one. If I could type. So it's a good thing to put these into the image because then you don't have to worry about installing them during the deployment process and save some time overall. But it's bad in that all of these require maintenance. And anytime you have any updates that need to be applied, you now have to update your image to include those latest updates. That's especially problematic for like Adobe Reader and Flash that are updated like every week. So you have to think twice on some of these to say, well, does this really belong in the image or does it not? And it's kind of a philosophical debate. You have to figure out network traffic, time, and maintenance effort. Which one is most important for you? And make your decisions based on that. Most people tend to put a core set of maybe a dozen things into the image itself, and everything else gets layered on during the deployment. So I think that's enough applications. I mean, typically you might put your antivirus software and your VPN clients and other things into the image at this point, but this would be a good representative sample to start off with. So I don't actually need any drivers to build an image just because I am going to be working in a virtual machine that doesn't require any, but still I want to do some safety mechanisms. I'll create a folder called for Windows PE, and then create a selection profile by the same name. Where I select any driver that's in that folder. It's also possible that I could have packages for Windows PE, so I could create a new folder under packages for any Windows PE specific packages. And then I could modify my selection profile to include that as well. So why do I want to do that? Well, by default, MDT is going to take all of the drivers, all the language packs, all the security updates, and it's going to try to inject them all into Windows PE. It's smart enough on the driver's side to only do NICs and mass storage drivers, so that's not too bad. But on the security updates and language packs, it really can't tell if they're applicable to Windows PE or not. It could actually use DISM and ask, is this applicable to Windows PE? But it takes as much time to ask the question as it does to just try to install it and let it fail. So MDT takes the easy approach and just tries to inject every single update, and if they fail, it just logs the message and moves on to the next one. So if I want to save a little bit of time, I create these Windows PE selection profile, and then go into the properties of the deployment share, and on my Windows PE settings, say instead of injecting all drivers and packages, only inject things that are for Windows PE. So I can optimize that process a little bit. So now let's say that in my master image, I've got these security updates. Maybe I also want to put language packs in the image. How many of you put multiple language packs in an image? A few of you. If you wanted to do something like that, I mean, the import process is fairly straightforward again. They're just like any other security update. You import them in as a language pack, in this case Japanese x64 for Windows 7. And MDT recognizes that these are language packs. And we'll see them as part of the actual wizard. It'll show them to us and let us pick one of those. So I did the x86 one before, I believe. No, I did the x64 one. Hopefully I did the other one. So now if I look through here, I should see language packs. And we don't actually show the platform column, so I can't tell which one's which from there. But I can see here AMD 64 versus x86. So the next thing is I need to tie all that together. So I need to create task sequences that will actually be used to create the build. So let me create a task sequence called Windows 7 x64. I really can't type today. And for that, I'll use a standard client task sequence template. We basically use that one task sequence template for just about everything. It doesn't matter if you're building an image, deploying an image. It has the right conditions in it so that it only does the appropriate actions based on the scenario it finds itself in. All right, which one did I say? I think I said x64, so let me choose that. I don't need a product key. Again, I'm using KMS. I can specify the full name and organization that gets injected into the OS. We actually had a big debate about, well, what we put in as the default homepage, and because no one could agree, we said, fine, well, the default's going to be about blank. So if you want something other than about blank in your image, you probably want to put in something like live.com or whatever homepage you want in there. We need the local administrator account password because we used that to actually do the deployment process. I can't type that either. That's better. And at that point, we'll create the task sequence, which is really nothing more than an XML file that lists all the steps and conditions that need to be executed to actually do the build. It also adds an unattend.xml file. That unattend.xml file is what tells Windows Setup how to install Windows. So let me do that same thing for the x86 one, and then we'll look to see what that unattend looks like. Same thing, select my OS. Should probably have the same home page between x86 and x64. Man, they're even the right length this time. That's better. Okay, so now we have two task sequences, one for x64, one for x86. If we look on the OS Info tab, there's an Edit Unattend.xml button. If I click on that, it will launch the Windows System Image Manager. That's a tool from the Windows Automated Installation Kit, whose sole purpose is to customize the install of Windows. So MDT ships with a couple of default unattend.xml templates. Oops, I missed. And they set the standard settings for a Windows install that you would need to do it silently and to get the MDT process to continue once the new OS is in place. But if you wanted to tweak that, you could. So in order to run Windows System Image Manager, you have to point it to a distribution share, which is kind of a smaller version of what MDT uses as a deployment share, so we just pointed at that. You need the catalog of a WIM file that has all of the component information about that OS, and then you can set the settings on each one of those. It is a fairly complex installation process compared to Windows XP. There's now a 7-phase process that it goes through. Fortunately, you really only need to focus on the specialized phase and, to a certain extent, the UBI system phase. Those are the phases that control what happens once the OS is installed and booting up for the first time. So those are the equivalent to mini setup that you would have run into before. So if I wanted to add something into there, I could go to the help files and it'll tell me all about all the different settings that are there. I could also go and find the setting that I want. So I happen to know that there is a setting in there called fdeny something, which is used to enable terminal services. And it'll find that for me in the list of components in the operating system, and there are a lot of components with a lot of settings. And I can see that by default fdeny ts connections equals to true, which is a double negative, so it really means that terminal services, remote desktop, is off by default. If I want it on, I can add this to my unattend file. So I can take that and drag it, and basically the first place that it allows me to drop it is probably where I want it. So starting from the bottom, work my way up. Okay, it wants to put this in the specialized phase. Makes sense. And then I can change true to false just by double-clicking, and then save my changes. So you can do a variety of configuration changes on Windows using the Windows System Image Manager, but it kind of becomes a more advanced operation that in a lot of cases you can achieve the same results with group policy preferences, or something like that. You'll also find that there are a lot of things that you can't do through the unattend file, like customize every single Internet Explorer option, customize every single Explorer option. So you may still need to get into some custom scripts in order to configure the shell or to configure Windows exactly how you want it. Those, though, can be added into the task sequence, which is all of the steps that are needed as part of this install process. And it might look kind of intimidating because if you expanded out all of these folders, there's probably 100 steps in the process. Fortunately, you can kind of treat it as a black box initially. Don't worry about what all of those 100 steps do. Just focus on, did it work or did it not work? We've gone through and tested a lot of this in our labs. We've got a test team of about 10 people that do nothing but run installs day in and day out. What a job. Wouldn't you like to have that one? And they've made sure that we don't have any big issues in these task sequence templates. But if you wanted to do customization, you can change any of this. We provide everything as VB scripts. You can go in and change our scripts if you want to. But for the typical customizations that you would want to make, you're going to focus in on the state restore phase, which is what runs in the new OS, and more specifically, probably on that custom task folder. That is a placeholder in the task sequence where we expect most people would want to put their own custom tasks. That happens after any applications have been installed, after any Windows updates have been installed, before BitLocker has been enabled, and before any user state's been restored. So it's kind of the logical place to put in your own custom scripts, your own tweaks to the default user profile, whatever you want to do, that's probably where you want to do it. Okay, so I have those task sequences. I should have gone ahead and created a folder for those as well, so let me do that. For master images. Then I can select these, drag and drop. Now they're in my folder. And at that point, all that's really left to do is, well, two things. First, I need to update the deployment share, which generates Windows PE boot images and optionally generates ISOs. We can then take those ISOs, mount them into the virtual machines, and use that to start the deployment process. So the update process is simple enough. I could just right-click and choose Update Deployment Share. Or if I wanted my console to continue to be useful for something else, I could do the same thing with PowerShell, because everything in MDT is PowerShell enabled. I could do add PS snap-in, Microsoft.bdd.ps snap-in, restore MDT persistent drives, update MDT deployment share. So that's really all there is to it. We have our PowerShell provider. We add that. We can use the restore persisted drive commandlet to say open up all the deployment shares that are currently open in the UI so that I don't need to type in the full path to those. I can then navigate into the deployment share, which is represented as kind of a logical drive, and I could do directories and copies and other things inside of there. And then I can run the actual update to go ahead and do that. I'm going to actually cheat, and let me see if I can actually cancel that. Give it a chance here. Because I've already kind of gone through this process and done it earlier today, actually yesterday. So let me open up one called Baked, which is kind of the same basic structure. You'll see that we've got some additional folders. We'll talk about those in a little bit, but the concepts are what we've already talked about previously, where we have our image applications. I've got a couple of additional ones in there. We've got our original source files. We don't have any drivers. We've got the security updates for the master image and language packs. We've got the task sequences to create the master image. I was actually playing with one for XP as well, so the same process works there. And we've got that selection profile for Windows PE. When I go to a client machine then, which I'm not sure I have running right now, find my build machine. So basically I've created 2 VMs, and we'll see if I actually have enough memory to start another one. Got lots of VMs running on this machine. And that is configured already to point to the ISO that was generated when I updated that other deployment share. So we can see it's connected to the ISO that I generated. And that then boots into Windows PE, initializes the MDT scripts, makes the connection back to the deployment share, and then lets me choose the task sequence that I want to execute. So we would go through this wizard initially to kick off the build process. We'd answer a few questions. I haven't automated the full build yet at this point, so we'd have to go through this wizard each time, but generally you spend a minute or so answering these questions and then kick off the whole process. Walk away, come back later, and see if it was finished successfully. So I need credentials to connect to the share. At that point, it'll show me my available task sequences. Now, I booted in this case from an x64 boot image. I'm running setup.exe to do the installation, so it's only going to show me the 64-bit images to install. If I wanted to install the x86 image, I would need to boot from an x86 Windows PE. That's actually more of an MDT limitation than a Windows limitation. You can actually run an x86 version of setup.exe to install a 64-bit version of Windows 7, but MDT doesn't know about that. It's still back in the Vista RTM days when that wasn't actually possible. So, minor inconvenience at this point. You need to have 2 boot images, one for the x86 side, one for the x64 side. But I can choose that task sequence. Click Next, give it a computer name, which doesn't matter on a reference machine. Now, anytime you're building a reference image, you really want to leave it in a work group. That's the official Microsoft stance. Don't join it to a domain because then it picks up group policies and other remnants that you really don't want inside of your image. So leave it in a work group. If you try to put it into a domain and then wonder why MDT doesn't give you a choice to capture the image, we're trying to enforce that. So we won't show you the capture option unless you say join a work group. We'll see that here in a couple of screens. So we'll say that there's no user data to restore. There's our additional language pack. So if we want Japanese in that, we can check it off there. We can specify the language, time zone, and keyboard layouts as the defaults. They really don't matter too much in the reference image because you can also specify these settings when deploying the image. So those end up actually overriding whatever you specify here. Doesn't really matter, so we'll click Next. Time zone, I'm kind of partial to Pacific time. And then we can choose applications. Now, in this case, I've actually tweaked my deployment share a little bit, and you're actually seeing a side effect of that. So we're not seeing the other apps that I put in. You're seeing a filtered list. So I've already kind of moved on in my deployment share from saying I'm building an image to I'm deploying this image. So I've added a definition there that filtered those out. But assume that you can see the rest of those and you could check them off here. They would then install as part of the image. Now that's manually specifying what you want to put in the image. That's not what you want to do long term anyway. What you really want to do is go back to the server side and configure in the task sequence steps to install those specific applications in the order that you want them installed with whatever dependencies or any other custom scripts that you want to add with it. But initially for testing, this is fine. You can check off the apps that you want. And the nice thing is, if you choose 10 applications here and 5 of them fail, no big deal. MDT keeps going, and at the end of the process, you get all the errors from those 5. So this becomes an iterative process. You look at the batch of errors, you fix the apps that aren't working right, you run another build, and then look at the next set of errors that you run into. Eventually, when you get all the errors worked out, then you can put them in as task sequence steps and tell the task sequence to stop on failures so that in those cases, you don't accidentally capture an image of a broken task sequence. You make sure that everything works before you capture it. So I could check off stock viewer. In this case, I'm going to skip it for right now. I can specify that I want to capture an image, and by default it gets put back into the captures folder on the deployment chair. And then it's ready to go. So that wizard is basically just setting a bunch of variables to say, task sequence, here's what I want you to do. So the task sequence has conditionals in it that look at these variable values. The scripts themselves will look at these variable values, and it'll branch accordingly to do the right thing as it's going through. So when we click begin at that point, it will format and partition the disk. It'll launch setup. It'll begin the install process. And probably an hour from now, it'll come back and actually spit out an image. So at that point, you would want to take that image and pull it back into MDT to repeat the process. But now, instead of for building an image, you're going to use it for deploying that image. So if I switch back to my server here, you'll see that I've actually imported those images already, my x64 one and x86 one, into a folder called master images. I've then created 2 new task sequences for deployment to deploy those, and now I've added in drivers. So if we look under out-of-box drivers for deployment, I've created folders by make and model, and then imported the specific sets of drivers, basically just by right-clicking, choosing import drivers, and pointing to a folder structure that contains what I want to pull in. So I'm kind of subscribing to the model then of being a control freak. If you look through some of my blog postings, we talk about the different strategies that you can use for drivers, and we could talk for hours just about drivers. But the basic idea is that in this case, you want complete control over which drivers are put onto which models of machines in your environment. So in order to do that, you have to build up the folder structure by model and then customize MDT to say only consider the folders in this list. So to do that, first of all, we've got the folder structure, but then we would need to go to the task sequence, like in this case, the x86 one. Go to the task sequence, which is exactly the same as the task sequence that we were looking at to build the image. And if we look at the inject drivers step, by default it looks at anything in the all driver selection profile, which is all drivers, not surprisingly. And I will change that to say nothing. Why nothing? Well, MDT is injecting drivers kind of on an additive basis. So it would look at the task sequence or the selection profile and then add in any specific folders that we told it about. We haven't told it about any yet, so let me go ahead and add one of those in here. If I go into the properties of the deployment chair, I can add a rule that says driver group 001 equals %make \% model. So I can use variable substitution. MDT has already retrieved the make and model from WMI, so it knows what this machine is. I can tell it, select the folder containing drivers that match the make and model. The word group is kind of a carryover from previous versions of MDT, but the idea is that with that, we'll substitute in what we found in WMI, and then we can choose that particular folder by path. And then that folder plus nothing equals that folder. If you would have left it at all drivers plus anything is still all drivers. So it's one of those games you have to play to get MDT to do what you want it to do. So we would end up having to then do the same thing for x64, and potentially we may want to do the same thing for packages as well. So we have this folder for packages for master image. We really don't want to try to inject those same drivers again. So we can come in here and find the apply patches step and change it from all packages to for deployment. So if I look at that selection profile, I created a for deployment selection profile that only selects the drivers, which shouldn't even be in there. So we can leave it in there. And then the packages and task sequences. So at that point, we could now build the boot images and use those same boot images, well, really that we already generated, to deploy our custom images out to all the machines in our environment. We could do the refresh, the replace scenarios, bare metal deployments, whatever we wanted there. The challenge, though, is we now have a deployment chair that contains two sets of data. It contains the reference image creation stuff, and it also contains the deployment stuff to deploy that reference image. You really don't want the people going around doing the deployment, whether they're end users or technicians, to see the stuff that you use to create your image. So to avoid that, we can create that selection profile. In this case, that was the for deployment one. And then in the rules of the deployment chair, say, when you display the wizard, only display what's in the for deployment selection profile. So the wizard that you see will only show task sequences that fall into that. It'll only show applications that fall into that. It limits the view of what's in your deployment chair. So that's one potential way to solve the problem. You can use selection profiles and set variables to control who sees what based on whatever criteria you come up with. Or you could just say, well, I'm going to use two different deployment chairs. I'm going to create one in my lab, and I'm going to use that for building and capturing images and defining my production task sequences. But then I'm going to replicate all that content into another one and use that for my deployment. So you could certainly do that with MDT as well. I can create a link deployment chair, and as part of that link deployment chair, specify that I want to copy all of the content from a particular selection profile over to it. So at that point, once I've defined that, I could just right-click, say to replicate content on whatever schedule I wanted, even using PowerShell and a scheduled task if you wanted to do that, and then have all the clients point to that share instead of the master one that you're using for all of your maintenance activities. The advantage of that is as you're going in and adding a new driver or adding a new version of an application or whatever you're doing to it, you then control on what frequency does that get copied into production and becomes what everyone else is using. Well, what if I wanted to do media deployments? You could certainly do that with MDT as well. We can specify a folder to put the media into. We can specify the selection profile again. I want everything that's for deployment. What boot images do we want? Do we want to generate an ISO? And then it will put in that folder two different things. It'll put the ISO in it. So if we scroll over here, we'll see that that's a 9 gig ISO. Not sure about you, but last time I checked, ISOs can't be burned above about 8.5 gig unless you're talking about some really capable burners. So I might need to instead define selection profiles by platform and generate one for x86 and one for x64. This one got so big just because I had both of them in the same one. The nice thing, though, is I could actually say, well, I don't even need to use an ISO. I'm going to use a USB key. USB keys easily get up to that size. 16, 32, 64 are easy to get these days. All I need to do is format that thing on Windows Vista or Windows 7, and then X-copy the contents of this folder onto the USB key, take it to a machine, plug it in, and boot it. If I'm doing a refresh, well, in that case, plug it in and run lighttouch.vbs. You don't need to boot the machine from Windows PE in that point, but you can do the entire deployment from a USB key. So really nice, really scalable, easy to do. So how are we doing on time? Got about 5 minutes left. We should probably actually kick off a deployment to prove that I'm not making stuff up here. Let me move over to a client machine running XP. Start a command prompt and just run cscript. So that's the script that kicks off the process. It will go through and do some gathering from WMI and other sources to figure out what's the current state of the machine, what make and model does it have, what processor capabilities does it have. And then based on what it finds, it'll then run the wizard and ask you the same types of questions that we were seeing in a bare metal deployment. Now, this is an x86 version of Windows XP. It knows by inspecting the processor that this machine is capable of running an x64 OS. So we get all of the choices. We can deploy an x86 OS or we can deploy an x64 OS. It doesn't matter. If we choose Windows x64, we want to do a refresh. We can keep the same computer name. We can join a domain if we want, or we can join a work group. I'll just put it in a work group to save some time. Do we want to save our data and settings? So yes, let's automatically determine the location so that we run USMT. Do we want to generate a complete computer backup? So we'll use ImageX and create a WIM of the existing OS. That takes a long time and uses a lot of disk space. So that's a valid option if the local machine has more than 50% of its disk space available, because we can just drop the WIM locally and not have to move it off the box. But it will add a couple of hours to the process, so it's probably something you don't want to do on every machine, just selectively. I can choose my language packs again. Time, keyboard, time zone. Any additional applications that I wanted to install. So here I can say to install Stock Viewer. Do I want to enable BitLocker or not? If I say yes, it'll go through the necessary manipulations to do that. And once it boots into Windows PE, it needs to be able to get back to the network. So we need to specify some credentials so that it can actually do that. And that's really all we need. At this point, the task sequencer will kick off. We'll see the progress dialog show up. It'll start off by running through the USMT gathering process to capture the user state, then stage a version of Windows PE onto the hard drive, modify the boot process to boot into PE, then install the new OS, boot into the new OS, install the apps, restore the user state, and we're off to go at that point. How do you configure? Yeah, so the question was, how can you tell it how to partition the hard drive? By default, we would always recommend that you use a single large partition. And if we look in the task sequence, that's what's in there by default. So if we go to the task sequence tab, there are actually two different format and partition steps in here for reasons that aren't really important right now. But if we find one of them, format and partition disk, it says by default, create a single partition that uses 100% of the available disk space. So if you wanted some other custom partition structure, yeah, you can come in and modify that. The thing that you shouldn't do is modify the unattend.xml to put your partitioning in there and expect Windows Setup to do it. Windows Setup will do it, but it'll break the task sequence in the process, because the task sequence doesn't expect the machine to get repartitioned and reformatted out from under it. So it has to be done in a controlled way with the task sequence step. As far as removing existing ones, you would have to create your own diskpart script to insert into the task sequence to do that. And our default unattend template actually has a setting in it that says to extend. So if you removed partitions from the end of the disk and then did a deployment, you would find the deployment actually took up the whole disk as a result. So we're trying to do what we can to encourage you to go to a single partition model where you have every bit of the operating system and user data there on that single partition. So that's kind of the run through of MDT Light Touch and the whole deployment process that goes through there. We could probably spend another hour or so going through kind of the same scenario with Configuration Manager. Unfortunately, we don't have another hour or so, or I guess we could lock the doors and not let you out. But the idea there is that most people would still use MDT light touch to create that reference image, but then instead of importing the resulting WIM files into MDT, import them into Configuration Manager, then create your Configuration Manager task sequences to do the deployments out from there. So the image created by MDT can be used with WDS, can be used with Config Manager. They're fully interchangeable images regardless of where you create them from. You can do all kinds of extensions to that process. I showed in the kickoff session on Monday a new P2V solution that we're working on that would actually take your existing XP OS and turn it into a VM and set it up with VPC so that now you have your new Windows 7 operating system with a complete image of your Windows XP machine running inside of it. Certainly an option in some scenarios as a kind of an additional option to XP mode or MedV. It's the third option along those same lines. We can also support back-end databases. So if I wanted to control in a database what apps get installed on each machine or what settings get used on each machine, I can do that. We can call web services. So if you've got your own asset management database that you want to hook into the deployment process, you can certainly do that. So lots of flexibility built in around those types of scenarios. We've tried to blog a lot about those on my own blog, which is the first link on the page, and the deployment guys, which are a bunch of MCS consultants, have done additional creative solutions to try to take what MDT provides, either with or without Config Manager, and extend that to give you more capabilities. I've got another session tomorrow on troubleshooting, which is going to be pretty much all PowerPoint slides as opposed to this one, which is pretty much all walkthrough. And that will be looking at all the different pieces and parts of the deployment process and looking to see, well, what could break as part of this process? How would I figure out why did it break, and then what can I do to fix it? If you need additional assistance, you can definitely send me an email message. A lot of people do. I would just point out, be aware of the 1-minute rule. There's a book that was published by Microsoft Press that makes the argument that says that if you get an email in and you can respond to it in less than a minute, you should do it immediately and not put it on the for follow-up pile. I follow that rule. If I look at it and say I can answer this in a minute or less, you'll get an immediate response back from me. Otherwise, yeah, it's on the pile that I might get to in 2 or 3 months. I really like the long flights from the U.S. to Australia and back again because I can do a lot of email in that amount of time. There's also a forum on TechNet that you can go to and ask a lot of questions there. It's actually fairly busy. There's an OSD mailing list hosted by My IT Forum, and if you really get stuck, you can always call up Microsoft support. MDT is fully supported. MDT plus Configuration Manager is also fully supported. We talk regularly with the support teams that support those particular pieces for us. So that's pretty much all I wanted to cover. I did include some appendix slides that you can go through, download it from TechNet and look at them, but basically they're recorded walkthroughs showing you a video of what would it look like to do an MDT light touch deployment. What would it look like to do a Config Manager deployment using UDI? What would it look like to do a P2V migration using the new solution? So those videos are hooked into the deck. You just have to click next and they'll start playing for you. I expected to not have enough time to get to those. An hour session is really pretty tight, but you can look at those at your own leisure. So that more than exhausts my time. Thanks for listening to me ramble on and go through all those demos. Hopefully that was useful, and hopefully I'll see you in tomorrow's troubleshooting session as well.